Okay, shall we get started? I'll call the meeting to order, it being high noon. First order of business on the agenda is introductions. So my name is Norton Cabell. I'm your chair, at your pleasure.
Stephanie Jennings, City of Eugene staff.
Chris Pryor, Eugene City Council.
Kristen Carley, St. Vincent de Paul.
John Van Lanningham, Oregon Law Center.
Teresa Kennedy, City of Eugene staff.
Lydia Dysert, Minister Porter.
Karen Sachs, Deb Northwest, and for Emily Raymond.
Steve Oaks, Homes for Good Housing Agency.
It's always so nice to say to the same people who know who I am. Joe Burney, Lane County Commissioner, District 2, Springfield.
Oh, Isaac Judd, local realtor.
Jenna Goodley, local architect, board member.
Chris Wake, Housing Policy Board member.
And out there, Richard, who are you?
Richard Gutsky. So I am.
Still?
Friends, Groves, Eugene, Budget Committee.
I'm Jackie Lowe, Clinical Health Pro Services Prevention Campus.
Kurt Gray, citizen at large.
Michelle Stark, St. Vincent de Paul. Kara Smith, advocate for Lane County.
Josh, who are you?
Andrew Baraka.
Thank you.
City of Eugene staff.
Tom Doyle, retired guy.
Okay, welcome all. Next on the agenda is public comment. Anybody from the public want to talk to us about anything? We're already ahead on the agenda. Next is minutes approval. Mea culpa. I've been on vacation for the last week. I have not seen the minutes until 2 minutes ago. So, has anybody? John?
I only read part of them, but Bolofsky is misspelled several places in the list of who was attending, and then on the first page. Diana Bilovsky, O.V.
So if somebody has read the minutes and would like to move they be accepted, entertain that.
I move approval. as amended.
Okay. And I saw a second. So all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Good, thank you. Items from Housing Policy Board members and staff. I will remind you all that Housing Policy Board members consist of 2 elected representatives and I forget the number of citizen representatives. And we, not the elected, we all have 2-year terms. And I'm not sure, I forget whose terms are up this year. I know yours is, but who else? Anyway, the process is that next month, our elected representatives will either re-up or appoint somebody new. Chris has said that he's not going to, cannot stay. Would you like to explain or not?
Sure. I'll get to that in my...
Okay. So there is an open position. It has been posted. The time for posting comes up sometime, the application period is sometime in the middle of December. And then the 2 elected representatives will make a decision about that. And so the rest of, I assume, no, I shouldn't assume, they may reappoint the members, current members whose terms are up, or they may not, that's their decision.
And in the event of a tie? I'm just kidding.
And at the same time, next month, the chair serves a 1-year term, and we have a vice chair as well. And so we will hold an election for those 2 positions next month. That's all from me. Anything, Councilor Pryor?
Yeah, I would, and I don't know whether Stephanie was going to do this, but I will. As you recall, everybody knows that House Bill 2001 and 2003 were passed in the last session. And those create the mechanism that says all cities above a certain size have to allow for duplex, triplex, and fourplex construction within R1 zones. And while they set the general rules and the timeline for when this needs to occur, they did not establish the actual rules that will govern how that is implemented. And part of the reason for that is there's a timeline that's given that says cities can adopt their own rules as long as they are in within the boundaries of 2001. But if they fail, for whatever reason, to get their rules adopted by the middle of 2021, then the state's rules will then be put in place instead. So if you don't get them done, you're still going to be subject to them, and they will be the ones that will be coming down from the state. So the DLCD has established a rulemaking committee to give advice on what these rules should look like, what they should have in them, and what kinds of flexibility or lack of flexibility or clarity or certainty should be built into them. And I have been invited, as I mentioned at the last meeting, to serve on that advisory committee for rulemaking. And what's important about it is, hopefully, cities will have their own rules in place, and they will be in convergence or coincide with 2001. But if they shouldn't, we want to make sure the rules that do come down from Salem do try to reflect the best outcomes or the best interests of both communities and House Bill 2001. So that's why this is really a very important committee. And they want to go into a deep dive and go into great detail about what these rules might look like. So they have really invited an A-list, I'm not including myself, but an A-list of very smart people who will help to put these rules together. And in order to give them advice, they're also setting up 4 subcommittees, one for large cities, one for small cities, one to talk about infrastructure, and then one to talk about how to pay for more affordable housing. And Stephanie's been invited to serve as an alternate on one of those committees. And so we'll be working very closely. There's a number of folks. Hugh Pritchard, who you may know, is serving also on one of those committees. Springfield has representatives that are serving on those committees and also on the group. So I think Lane County is reasonably well represented, but there was only room for 2 elected officials. And so I was one of the 2 elected officials that was invited to serve, and I want to really make sure that these rules, once they're put together, do as good a job as possible in case they will be applied to communities. And we will be meeting every month for probably the next 9, maybe 10 months to try to come up with these rules, which will then be recommended. We won't actually write the formal rules, but we will make the recommendations on what those rules should look like. It also includes, in addition to 2001, 2003, which at the surface required all communities to establish an inventory of what kind of affordable housing is available in their communities. Not just any housing, but affordable housing. And if they are determined to be short, what are the mechanisms, and they have to report what those mechanisms will be to create an increased amount of affordable housing. And to go along with that is the notion of, okay, if you're going to build more affordable housing, what mechanisms or tools will you put in place or will you have available to you to pay for that affordable housing? And so that is what one of these subcommittees that I'll be serving on will be focusing on, is how can we pay for this affordable housing if we want to build it. So I think that will also be a very important committee. So I'll give you more updates as we have them. The next meeting will be on the 16th of this month, and then for every month after that. And I will try to keep you as updated as I can, and also solicit your feedback on ideas or perspectives that you may have on this rulemaking process.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So this is just cities of a certain size.
There's a set of rules for cities over 25,000, and then a set of rules which are less for cities under 25,000.
10,000 to 25.
10 to 25,000. So if you're very small, this doesn't apply. But if you're over 10,000, the rules will apply to varying degrees.
So of course the big ones are us and Salem and Portland. Where are those 2 cities in this process?
Salem and Portland?
Yeah.
They have representatives, mostly at the staff level, or the department level, or the executive level. But they only had 1 elected official from a large city and 1 elected official from a small city. And for some reason, they asked if I would be the representative for large city.
Okay. John?
Just a couple of things. One, note that it's great that Chris is doing this on our behalf, but also it's a huge commitment on his part, because this will be time intensive and complicated and political. 2, just because my memory is fading as I get older, I just looked, and it is 2022 for the larger cities. And if the city does not adopt its own rules by then DLCD's rules, which Chris is going to help make, will go into effect automatically. So a city can't avoid this as long as the law is in effect. The smaller cities, the 10 to 25,000, are only required to do the duplex part, not the triplex and fourplex, and their deadline is June 30 of 2021.
Right.
The other thing that's important to understand is that the duplex, the threeplex, triplex, fourplex is required to be allowed in areas. That is a term that is not defined in the statute. The rules will have to define it. Local governments, if the rules don't apply to them, local governments can define themselves. And it doesn't mean that every lot has to have a goddamn, threeplex or fourplex. It just means
Well,
the
that's an
area has to,
opinion.
that area has to allow some of those. And so cities have quite a bit of discretion still to decide where they want to put the increased density. And the reason it's areas is because there is no Oregon Revised Statute definition of that term or neighborhoods, which is what the proponents initially thought about. They thought that we ought to allow, in every neighborhood ought to allow some triplexes and fourplexes. So.
Some of us
that's
think
a
that it
little
should be
backwards.
every lot.
So as you can see from John's clarification, it's extremely important that the rules, whatever they're going to be, have a very high level of clarity built into them, so that you can't argue that I can't do it because it's too vague, which is an argument I have heard in the past. So I think what we'll be striving for is a very high level of definition and clarity, just as John said, so that we can make sure that people absolutely know what this law says and absolutely what this law expects to happen.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just add
Yeah.
on this topic? So I mentioned at the last meeting that I'm the alternate for the housing administrator position, and really my involvement is really focused on the housing production strategies, the developing of financing tools. And, you know, I think what is interesting about this, I mean, for a very long time, local jurisdictions in Oregon have been responsible for establishing housing needs and understanding housing needs and having a plan for making land available. 2003 kind of shifts it more into having a housing production plan, which is much more significant. And so there is kind of an expansion of not just planning for growth and housing development, but finding ways to actually implement it. And so this is something that I'll be thinking a lot about. How do we connect what we're already doing to the housing production strategy? How do we help connect different resources that are available at the state level to the new requirements that the state has created through House Bill 2003?
Okay, thanks. John? Karen?
Yeah, we have a couple exciting things happening. In January, I mentioned last couple meetings, we closed on our Cottage Grove and Florence projects for Land Trust Homes. In January, we'll be doing an event at the site in Cottage Grove, kind of post-holidays. So we'll keep everyone updated on that. And we also are looking at moving forward on a property over in Bethel off of Royal Avenue, and looking to put 30 to 40 new homes on that land, and looking at hopefully making them all community land trust for ownership. And we've been doing some community meetings, neighborhood meetings, meeting with the school district. So obviously that still has to go through funding, but we own the property and are looking forward to moving forward. So fingers crossed on that. We're hoping to apply for funds in January.
Well, good for you. Steve?
One thing I had was, and I didn't bring the update, so I'll bring it next month, but the wait list for housing choice vouchers was open for about 10 days in November. And so next month I'll bring the numbers and all the final tally. I know that I think there was 1,700 applications on the first day. They obviously tailed off after that, but so there's still definitely still showed the need. I'll bring more specifics.
Surprise, surprise. Thank you.
We also note that the open house for the MLK project was standing room only.
Yeah, that's great.
Very well attended.
That was best one ever.
Well, now that John took the wind out of my sails,
Well, you was
I'm
in.
just kidding. I have three things briefly. One is I would like to publicly commend you for the work that Lori Halbert, is that how I pronounce her name? Lori Halbert, John's staff, has worked diligently with the Springfield community, especially those of us that did not want the patrician rezoned. and is now working with those of us who, under the radar, are seeing what we can do to make sure there is, in fact, housing for the people that will be displaced. So kudos to her, if I may, through you, John. Number two is that I had the occasion to give a report to the Springfield City Club of sort of how the first year was going. Their title was How the First Year Went, but I pointed out it's 10 months in. Who's counting?
Still time to scroll.
Yeah, still time to redeem. And the item which received the most attention was when I mentioned the 170 units that Homes for Good has planned for Springfield. On the books, 100 in Glenwood and 70 some behind the Fred Meyer. Yeah, and just to let you know that this whole issue of housing, I mean, just getting out there, I spoke to a very crowded room, and they really were so enthused to hear that. Most people were not aware of that. And then finally, I would just like to share that I'm a week off of the annual Association of Oregon Counties meeting, and that's all the county commissioners are invited. Most of them show up in the state, which means the federal politicians have their reps there, and vendors have their reps there, and everybody, you know, it's a beehive. So the major theme was housing. And so I wanted to share with you that I left my fellow commissioners to meet with county administrators, because I wanted to be where the smart people were, and that were figuring out how the hell are we going to implement 2001 and 2003. They didn't know as of right now. I sent Isaac, because he was chair at our last meeting, so I figured he was the chair, sorry, that I could send to everyone through whomever you say. But it was a wonderful video, maybe some of you have seen it, that Tillamook County put together on the housing crisis there. And it contained so much humanity. It wasn't a bunch of government people sitting around a room discussing, you know, how we're going to implement. It was people talking about the human impacts, and that they were alone. They're going to have to figure this out for themselves. And so I encourage, maybe we show that. It's a 20 minutes, but either show it to everyone at one of our meetings or just pass it around. But the thing I wanted to mention about
You
that...
can send a link?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, give me a mailing list. I'll just send one.
Or just give it to Stephanie, or present it.
Will do. Thank you. Sorry I didn't do that already. Sorry I put the onus on you. And then finally, what I wanted to share was, because it relates to what Chris and John had mentioned, heard a very strongly attended session on HP 2001-2003. And it was put on by the head of Eco Northwest, a gentleman who I envy for his youth, good looks, and height. And
Who was that?
I forget his name. He took over from. No, he took over from Ed.
Yeah, he had retired.
Yeah, and another young man who's the head of the Oregon Realtors Association, and I spoke to them for half an hour after, and suggested to them, and I'm sharing this suggestion with you, that that one, I challenge the notion that we have had 11 years of prosperity if 156 million Oregonians are one paycheck or accident away from homelessness. That I challenge the measure that this is a prosperous economy, and challenge the measure that it's prosperous if 3 individuals have as much wealth and assets in America as the bottom 150 million of us. But nonetheless, we talked about that. And I suggested to them in all their government planning, which I'm a little skeptical of still, even though now I'm in it, I suggested that while they're trying to figure out a way to provide substantive technical assistance to communities to, in fact, implement, and I suggested, either the tail's going to wag the dog or the dog's going to wag the tail, the dog being the market, investors, private dollars coming in and being facilitated. So I suggested that they invite, and I offered to make some invitations for them, people that have billions of dollars of funds for multi-use and multi-family housing in the United States, be a part of the discussion. And you could reverse engineer what kinds of incentives, what kinds of subsidies, what kinds of new finance mechanisms would unleash their dollars. Because believe it or not, Oregon is a place a lot of these funds want to invest. We're expensive for us, but we're not for the Western United States. So I just am sharing that with you. They're taking me up on it. And I just think that that's a group that we ought to have at the table as we try and figure out housing production. Just a piece. Anyway, that's all.
Thanks, Joe. Isaac?
Yeah, just a couple things that I've been involved with. So the CET, the ongoing CET Trust Fund. So we had our second meeting for that, which still trying to get feet underneath us and like learn. There's not projects being proposed at this point. I think we're just working through everybody getting their head around how this fund is going to work and what their responsibility is and stuff. So not anything serious to report beyond what Stephanie, I'm sure, will chime in on. But it's a good group of people, and it's I have high hopes that we're going to move forward with some good projects eventually. The second thing is I'm working as a representative on not the urban reserves. Is it urban reserves? Yeah, the urban reserves panel. Sorry, it was a pretty long meeting late at night. So I was a little bit in the weeds on that one, but that's where they're doing the studies for potential areas for the urban growth boundary to expand into. And so there was a lot of technicalities, and there was a lot of people who were had a lot of expertise in there. It's not into the weeds of what we're building and what ratios of things building. So I didn't feel like I was contributing much to that meeting, but I would welcome anybody who wants to chime in. If I don't know when the next meeting is, maybe 4 or 6 months out, it sounds like. But if there's anything that you would like me to bring in from Housing Policy Board to that discussion, I'm happy to do it. So that's it.
Jen?
I don't know that I have anything super substantial. I'm still working on those 2 tiny houses over at Emerald Village, and we just put sheet metal on one of them over the weekend, and it's adorable. And if you want to go on Facebook, we did a little time-lapse video of that, so kind of fun. And then
Facebook for Emerald Village.
I think they reposted it, so you can find it there, yeah. And then I actually don't know a lot about this project, but I've seen flyers for it, and Dylan dropped one off at our office. Dylan Lamar, does anybody know much about this, is doing a project where he's building a couple of houses in Springfield, and kind of trying to rally people to participate in that process, to learn about building, and then end up potentially purchasing one of the 2 homes that they're building.
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody have more details about it than I do?
No, I'm sorry, but I'm aware of it.
I think it's 3 units, and it's the backyard barn building or barn raising. I think. Yeah, I think that the idea is to have 3 separate families or individuals coming together to purchase one piece of land together, or and the property, and so I think it's kind of an interesting style because it's not something that's commonly done in our area, and so it'd be interesting to watch that and see how successful that is.
Okay, thanks.
So this is my last meeting with you guys. That I'm sure it was announced last month that I decided not to return next year. It's an election year, and so I'm still chair of the party. They haven't kicked me out yet. And so I'll be working a lot on elections. So I would probably see you all in another capacity. Thanks for putting up with me for the last 2 years. And I think that over the last 2 years that we have accomplished we have some accomplishments, that we were able to end the sunset on the rental housing code. So that's a huge deal for a lot of people. That we were able to pass a CET, which I guess is good. We also left a lot on the field. We left a lot of stuff on the field. And it's not necessarily because of this group. I know that everybody here is trying their best. And so my hope, my hope is that whoever takes my spot is way more militant than me. But, whatever it is that you're doing, do the next thing. Like, do one more thing, because our housing politics are broken. That we have, calcified into these like intransigent factions, and until the developers acknowledge that they are going to need to pay taxes, and until the NIMBYs acknowledge that people who don't have money are going to move into their neighborhood, we're never going to get anywhere. And so what we're doing is not working. And that my hope is that this group is honestly the bright, as frustrated as you guys have all seen me get, like, this is the brightest spot in all of the quasi-governmental activity around the issue of housing. And so other people are counting on you. And I think I'll leave it there. But thank you all for not kicking me out for 2 years. I appreciate it. I've been allowed to come back, and next time I get to sit in the back with our friends.
I don't think there's an impeachment process.
Stern look from John.
John?
Not a stern look, Chris. Thank you for doing that. Two things. One, I wanted to ask Joe. You said that the AOC, the Association of Oregon Counties meeting, some counties were concerned about HB 2001.
Not concerned, just trying to figure out how to implement.
So it looks to me, I'm just looking at the bill now again to make sure. It looks to me like it only applies to the 3 metro counties. Is that different from what you heard?
What I heard was I'm sorry, I didn't.
Counties
mean
trying to figure out.
Could I do this? Could I answer that after there's any questions for Chris, since he just spoke and I don't want to take any wind from his sails?
I don't think anybody has any questions for me. I'm good.
Oh, okay. Well, it was a courtesy.
We have a mic today, so I can drop it. No, we're good.
I didn't get any impression. I got the impression that county administrators felt they had a role in supporting the communities in their counties.
I think they do, definitely.
And they were trying to figure out what that role was and how they could best organize to support that, right?
So, the metro area has so one of the exceptions in the bill is for areas outside of UGBs. And the metro area, UGB, is around the whole area, and those 3 counties are within that UGB. And so there is some unincorporated land that's not in a city. Otherwise, the bill largely just refers to cities. But those 3 urban counties are going to have to comply with HB 2001 as well. I don't think it's not Lane County or any other city than Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas. So I think I'm just rereading the bill myself to try to understand. Secondly, Chris's advocacy for pushing for stuff reminded me that last week, Taylor Smiley Wolf, who was the Speaker Kotek's housing policy person and did all the legwork on HB 2001 and 2003, was part of a panel presentation at Harvard at the they have a housing policy group there talking about 2001. That's an impressive thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, staff?
Yes. So the one item that I did want to talk about, just to add on to Isaac's comments, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee did meet in November. It was their second meeting. And again, part of this group, it's a fairly new group of folks trying to bring everybody up to the same page. We did have a discussion about housing needs in the community, reviewed a lot of the information from the 2015 Consolidated Plan analysis, and which I think was really helpful in terms of just grounding people's understanding of the different groups that we tend to think about when we think about housing needs, and really is preparation for the next 2 meetings. So the next meeting, which will take place on December 18th, is going to focus specifically on thinking about renter assistance and rental development and what are the best ways to use this new resource to support those 2 activities. The Renter Protections Committee has been diligently working on recommendations which will be presented at that meeting, and so we've talked about having representatives from the Renter Protections Committee present those recommendations to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee at that meeting. I've also talked with affordable housing providers about sharing their perspectives about what are the biggest challenges they face and what they think of as their priorities for using these new dollars and ways that they can help. The next meeting following the December meeting is in January. Teresa, do you have the date for the January Affordable Housing Trust Fund?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. That meeting will focus on homeownership, both homeownership assistance and homeownership development. And so we'll be organizing kind of a similar type of presentation and discussion, really with the goal of getting to recommendations. What we're aiming for at this point is fairly high level. You know, what we're estimating at this point is we'll have about $1 million. The money is accumulating at this point, so there's really not money to spend at this point. So this is really the good opportunity to do the planning and thought processes, and then with the intent of going to council in late February or early March with a high-level allocation, which would then enable us as staff to move forward with RFP processes for the various services. Any questions about the schedule? And of course, these are all public meetings. Anyone can sign up for the interested parties list. There is a page on the webpage for that, and so we're just continuing to try to make sure people understand when these meetings are occurring and how and when to provide input into this process. Did you want to add anything, Teresa?
Yeah, so the January meeting is January 28th from 9 to 11.
Where?
Sloped. First floor, downstairs.
Okay.
Thank you.
And that's the only major item for me that is not related to any other agenda items.
Okay, Teresa?
I'll just talk a little bit more about the HPB membership vacancy. I brought a handout with the notice information, and the spot that's being filled is a low-income representative. So if anyone is interested, we have information here. And applications are being accepted through 5:00 p.m. on December 20th. Thank you.
And may I?
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that I forwarded that to Mo Young, who's the equity person for the county, who's then sent it out to the various groups. So hopefully you'll get we'll get a pretty positive response.
Thank you.
Oh, of course.
Great. So, hi, Ellen.
I just wanted to give you all an update on the home request for proposals. That was for Springfield projects only. We did get one application from a for-profit developer called Modage Inc. And they have some affordable housing developments as well as building market rate developments. And they have proposed to build 24 new units on an existing property in Springfield on Pheasant Boulevard. And it's an existing apartment building with affordable units in it now. They work with Shelter Care and Homes for Good on those existing units, and they would work with Shelter Care and Homes for Good on the new units. And so the evaluation committee for that proposal is going to be Wednesday, December 18th at 3:30 in Springfield City Hall in the Jesse Main Conference Room. That's a public meeting, and people can make comments at a public hearing at the beginning. If you want more information about that proposal, it's on our website, so feel free to check it out. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Any other staff here? Okay, moving on. Proposed meeting schedule for next year, that's in your packet. I assume it's the first Mondays except for Labor Day. Looks like it to me. So, barring any dissension, we're going to make this our schedule for next year. Okay? Questions? All right. Renters Protection Committee update. So you will see in your packet a memorandum that came from that committee based on the work of our first two meetings. And so this will go to this will, my mind is sort of This will go to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee as sort of a recommendation. This is regarding education and training, kind of support for those kinds of activities for educating tenants mostly, but landlords as well, to some extent, on rights and responsibilities. At the last meeting, we talked about financial support for getting people into housing, for emergency rent subsidy support, and that sort of thing. And there will be a memorandum coming out from that, but the committee has not yet seen that. There's only a draft of it, so I don't have it yet for you all here. The idea is that we will have proposals from the tenant renters advisory, the Renters Protection Committee to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee to inform them, because I think later in their meeting this month, they may make some specific recommendations, some silos, and informed by the Renters Protection Committee. Questions? John?
Not a question, but added info.
Sure.
One, I wanted to emphasize that the landlords in the group, I'm on that group, the landlords in the group talked quite a bit about the need for mental health services, that they often feel like they have tenants with behavioral issues going on. They don't want to evict them, but they don't know what else to do. And so if there were a way to steer those tenants to get some mental health counseling, that would be very helpful to them.
And that's on the Renters Protection Committee agenda for this month or January, I can't remember which.
For further discussion, I can't remember.
Right, because they identified that.
Yeah. It just, that doesn't show up as strongly in this memo as our discussion did. And then in addition, we did talk about the trying to have some sort of local Section 8 rent assistance program. There is going to be a proposal in the 2020 legislative session for that. I think it's a long shot. But anyway, that's also an idea that seemed to be important to a lot of people.
And I don't think that's something that the Renters Protection Committee is really considering, especially since we really don't know what kind of money is involved.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah. And then we've been working, and we'll work further on, are there things that the local government could do to help? And we talked about application fees and multiple applications. We talked about deposits and the cost of those deposits. Jim Straub mentioned that he's considering using a program that appears to be an insurance program that an applicant would buy, and it would be less than the deposit, and it would be an alternative. The downside to that is that you don't get anything back at the end, but it is cheaper than paying a deposit, a big deposit.
And it's a little more
Or you
complicated than that.
or you could do the Portland thing, which is regulate deposits. So.
Right.
You don't get the deposit back anyway.
Yeah, I was thinking this.
I've returned one, I think. So,
100% of all of them.
We don't have to make rules because of people like you.
Yeah, I understand. But I think your statement was everyone. No one needs this, that's all.
so I'm feeling pretty good about how this process is moving along. The Renters Protection and, the spill out from that to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I'm looking forward to seeing some significant progress over the next few months. Any more questions about that? Any more comments about that? Consolidated plan process update?
Can I just make one comment
sorry, yes, of course.
about this? So as part of the consolidated plan process, we have been meeting with people who are doing other community-wide processes. And so right now, the community health assessment is wrapping up. And this is a collaboration between Lane County, United Way, and the hospitals in the area, the Coordinated Care Organization. And And mental health is something that has come out very strongly in the needs. And so their next step is the Community Health Improvement Plan. So this is something that we'll be talking about and communicating and sharing our findings with them. But I think really, the reflection of what landlords are seeing in their tenants is a broad. It's a broad community based issue. It's not just a renter issue per se. But they're seeing it as a reflection in the renter population.
She's gonna go with us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. All right, let's move on to the consolidated plan. So what has been passed out to all of you is a slightly shortened version of the presentation that I gave to City Council. And I've also been giving this presentation to multiple boards and commissions, and so I apologize to the elected officials who have heard this. I think Chris has heard this multiple times at this point. But I think
It takes a while to sink in.
So what I'd like to do is just kind of quickly run through the presentation, then talk a little bit about the next steps. Part of this is just helping people to understand, well, what is the consolidated plan? What is it about? What are the ways in which people can get involved in the process? And there will be different opportunities to do that at this point. Also just to have a discussion about the needs. And so what I'd like to do is kind of use our time to talk both about the consolidated plan and then the impediments to fair housing, and then leave time for general discussion because there's a lot of overlap between the two documents. So first of all, for the consolidated plan, so I've touched on this in previous meetings, but if you go to slide 4, so writ large, the consolidated plan sets priority needs and strategies for the use of CDBG and home funds over a 5-year period. This is a very high-level document, and so I try to kind of describe this as if you're looking at a restaurant menu, this is not the individual dishes on the menu, this is the categories of appetizers or desserts or main courses. And so what happens is through the action planning process is a much more kind of specific allocation of dollars. There are no dollars attached to the consolidated plan. But it is a prerequisite for receiving those dollars on an annual basis. We do anticipate that the two jurisdictions will receive about $14 million in funds over the next 5 years. You can think of this as sort of roughly 2/3 Eugene, 1/3 Springfield. This is largely based on population size. There are a lot of other factors that go into HUD's formula for the two federal programs that we receive funding through. The scope of the plan is not all housing needs in the community. It can surface those things, but it really, the actual uses of dollars has to be limited to the eligible uses of community development block grant and home dollars. So there's a little bit in here about what really works best with those resources. But affordable housing, human service capital facilities, job creation and improvements to low-income neighborhoods are typical uses of those funds that tend to work fairly well with all of the complex requirements that are associated with these dollars. When you think about the consolidated planning process, the purpose is to assess housing and community development needs of low-income people and neighborhoods through data analysis, community involvement, and agency consultation. We are lucky in our community. We have a lot of different ongoing venues where we're already discussing human services and affordable housing. Our consultants have been pleasantly surprised at the amount of conversations that is already going on, which is different than some other places where they have worked. The purpose of this process is to develop the goals, the strategies, the metrics over a 5-year period for investing those home funds and CDBG funds in the areas of greatest demonstrated need. So we need to be able to connect the priority needs with the strategies and all of the strategies with the priority needs. There is a goal of coordinating with other plans and resources to create partnerships and leverage investments. So housing is popping up in many different planning processes as a critical need. And so it's been identified as a critical issue affecting health. It's been identified as a critical issue in the community needs assessment process that was also led by the county to inform their human services. It's also identified as a critical issue when you're thinking about transportation, because where people live affect how far they have to drive to meet their daily needs, their access to public transportation, and other issues. So part of this is also thinking about governmental policies, how governmental policies affect availability and affordability of housing opportunities. The work that the City of Eugene has done through the Housing Tools and Strategies process has been very helpful and will be folded into this process. So part of this, we already have things underway that we have been working on that relate to the goals of the consolidated plan. And then lastly is conducting an analysis of impediments to fair housing. And so by receiving CDBG funds, the jurisdictions commit to affirmatively further fair housing. And so that is specifically for federally protected classes that have significant challenges accessing housing. So the structure diagram really just lays out, you do the con plan every 5 years, and then you do action plans each year. Our Eugene and Springfield must approve the consolidated plan, and then each year they must approve the action plan. And then we do project selection and implementation, and then each year we report on that progress through what's known as the Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report, or the CAPER. I did not make up these names. These are all HUD's names for these reports. So in terms of CDBG and home, CDBG is a very old program. It was created in 1974. It was actually created to consolidate a number of different federal grants into a block grant that is then provided to local jurisdictions through a formula. And so it is primarily focused on supporting existing communities, and so some of the requirements within it really focus on rehabilitation, revitalization, as opposed to new development. So for example, you cannot actually use CDBG funds to pay for the construction of new housing. You can use it for other housing uses. So all CDBG funds must meet a national objective. 70% of the funds must benefit a low-income person or neighborhood. And typically for Eugene, we've used almost 99% of the funds to benefit low-income neighborhoods or persons. You can use it to prevent or eliminate slums and blight, again, another HUD term, or in the event of a federally declared disaster, you can use it to meet an urgent need. So there are many jurisdictions in Oregon that receive direct allocations of CDBG funds. So Eugene receives a direct allocation and Springfield receives a direct allocation. None of the other jurisdictions in Lane County are large enough to receive a direct allocation, but they are, the state does receive CDBG funds for what's called the balance of state, and those CDBG funds are administered by Business Oregon. So for CDBG basics, there's just a little bit about this that I think it's useful. You can only use up to 15% of CDBG funds for human services, and the rest is really focused more on capital. And so I talked already about some of the ways in which you can use the CDBG funds. Home is really focused on expanding the supply of decent, safe, sanitary, and affordable housing, and may only be used for a limited set of activities related to affordable housing. Eugene is the entitlement jurisdiction for home. We formed a consortium with Springfield, and so Eugene receives home funds on behalf of Springfield, and we administer those home funds on behalf of Springfield because they are not large enough to receive home funds on their own. So again, fairly complicated program. I would say it's more complicated than CDBG. It really is best used for supporting new construction or acquisition of existing affordable rental housing. It does require a 25% match of non-federal funds, and you have to have a very high habitability standard and meet up to a 20-year period of affordability for projects. During that period of affordability, we monitor those projects every year for physical tenant requirements and also financial viability. So just taking a look at the 2015 consolidated plan, the major objectives. The biggest objective is increase the supply of affordable housing. We used both home and CDBG funds to support that objective. That includes the housing RFP that we do every year, the land banking program, the other sources, other kind of smaller goals that are built within that, but those are really the two major programs under increasing the supply of affordable housing. We use CDBG funds to rehabilitate existing housing. In Eugene, we have a revolving loan fund for rental housing that has been used by many of the providers to support affordable housing developments. And then also we have an emergency home repair program that primarily benefits low-income homeowners, and then also residents of manufactured home parks where they own the units but cannot afford to maintain them. Creating homeownership opportunities, we had a small goal around trying to use CDBG funds for down payment assistance. This was very challenging to do in the market. The market really doesn't work well for down payment assistance at this point in time because people's incomes are slightly above the 80% of area median income limit for use of CDBG funds. The units that are affordable to that population are not well maintained, so it's hard to meet the HUD habitability standard. And so really we think it's a very worthy goal to do homeownership assistance, but CDBG is really not the right resource to use for it. It's too restrictive.
And there's some thought about using Affordable Housing Trust Fund money for something.
Yes,
like
that has been a topic of discussion at Eugene City Council, and we will be talking about that during the January meeting. So really, this is kind of where the strategy comes in. When you have these different resources, which one is going to be the best tool for the program that you want to do. Removing barriers to affordable and supportive housing. This is also, of course, related to fair housing, the fair housing goals. We also have hold housing policy board meetings. This is a goal under removing barriers to affordable and supportive housing. There's some examples here of different projects that have been supported with both home and CDBG funds. And then also on the following page, there are projects in progress, both in Eugene and Springfield. And so moving on just to talking about the Community Development Strategic Plan. So the Community Development Strategic Plan, you can only use CDBG dollars. You can't use home dollars for community development activities. And so the three main goals within the plan, the 2015 plan, were support human service operations and capital facilities, provide business loans to create jobs and support microenterprises. And then lastly, we had a goal of making improvements to low-income neighborhoods and areas of slums and blight. So for the first goal, both Eugene and Springfield provide 15% of their CDBG funds to the Human Services Commission, which is then provided to human service agencies for core operating support. And that's really been focused on homeless and special needs organizations. So think about like First Place Family Center, Relief Nursery, Catholic Community Services have been major recipients of those dollars. Food for Lane County. And then Capital Facilities has also really been focused on those major facilities that are critical for providing human services. For business loans has been a significant activity for Eugene. We have a revolving business loan fund. So we're not really adding new money to it. We're simply revolving the dollars that have been returned over time through the loans.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
How much is in the revolving loan fund?
How much?
It's over $1 million.
Well, so I don't know the amount, the total amount that's in the fund at this point in time. We typically think of it in terms of how much program income it generates per year, and so it can generate anywhere between $500,000 and $1 million of program income per year.
How can $1 million fund generate that?
No. The fund is bigger than that, but that's the kind of money it's the repayments.
What percent of it would you say is actually revolving versus how much of it is tied up in loans that aren't moving right now?
So all of the loans have payments. Any loan, so in terms of, and they all have schedules for repayment.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because the county has a business revolving loan fund with LCOG, and it's just frozen now because it's completely subscribed and nothing's happening. So obviously this is not that.
Yeah, the degree of liquidity
Yeah.
within it.
No, we have money available.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
We have money. No, it's a good question. We have money available, and so there, and because program income is coming in on an annual basis, we have the ability to make more loans on an annual basis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you can replenish it with CDBG funds.
You can. We can add more. We have found that the program income really has kind of met the demand over time. So there hasn't been a need to, but yes, you can always add more.
It's in balance right now.
Yeah. And then the third goal, this is really something that we wanted to have the ability to do if needed, but it was not a major focus in the planning process. And so, we did want to have it as an option. And so there is one activity that Eugene did under this goal, which was actually a carryover from the last planning process. It was improving the Charno Mulligan Park, which is located in a low-income neighborhood. So the next two slides are examples of projects. And so at the top, Catholic Community Service Center in Eugene. It both benefits from operating support, and recently we completed rehabilitation of that building. Shelter Care Homeless Recuperation also received a Human Service Capital Facilities grant. The service station has received multiple investments over time. Food for Lane County is supported by both Eugene and Springfield. We support both the dining room as well as the food box program. And then the next slide is examples of job creation projects. I should mention that the microenterprise training is grant. It has been a $30,000 grant per year to provide microenterprise training.
Let me ask another question.
Sure.
I see Arcomoto as one of the supported job creation projects. How much of this went into that?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
And the only reason I ask is that I know that they've gone into several rounds of private financing, and I'm wondering why we would put public money in a company that's getting dollars privately. I'm just curious. What? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I don't know the
I
details of
apologize.
it. I'd have to contact our economic development staff to answer those questions. So I will say, though, one of the requirements for receiving those funds is that for every $35,000 loan, they have to create one job that's available to a low-income person. And so, sure. No, but that's just the basis of the loans, is that they are actually creating jobs that are available to low-income people.
Is that all over? And do we know how long they keep that person? Yeah, there are requirements for how long people are retained. You can't just hire them and then fire them.
Yeah. I don't know that off of the top of my head.
See, in my question, I'm realizing I will stop because they really relate to digging deeper. For example, there are many programs that will provide dollars for creating jobs and that have a time length attached,
Yeah.
but the employer doesn't meet that in some instances. And, you know, so it's a legitimate question,
Yeah.
that's all.
If you want to send me an email with your questions, I'd be happy
Yeah,
to
I
forward
would.
them to Aaron
Okay.
Doreen,
I
who
don't always
is
hear
the
from this.
business
Yeah.
analyst, and I can have him respond to your questions.
Sometimes it's a timing thing.
Yeah. So, so in terms of the next steps in the process, so really, you know, we're looking at our past activity, thinking about how we did with the goals, assessing the community needs. So we are working with an external consultant, the Cloudburst Group, who is doing most of the data analysis for us. And we have a community survey that is out right now. I'm hoping everyone here has responded to and completed the community survey. If you have not, we will resend the link to everyone. The deadline for completing the survey is Friday. So then looking also at market conditions. So you are looking at really what are the economic conditions for development in the community. And then setting the priority needs, and then setting the strategies and the goals and metrics. So what is happening right now is that needs analysis work is happening, the survey work is happening. We have a consolidated plan advisory committee, which includes 3 representatives from Eugene and 3 representatives from Springfield. Councilor Pryor is the council representative from the city of Eugene. Councilor Marilee Woodrow is the council representative from Springfield. And so the first meeting of the Plan Advisory Committee will be either on the 17th or 18th of December. We're figuring out the time at this point, but I'll definitely let folks know. That meeting really is going to focus on reviewing the community needs information. And then in January, there will be a second meeting of the Consolidated Plan Advisory Committee, where we will develop the draft strategies. In late January, we're going to have a community open house where we're going to share the draft strategies and get community feedback on the draft strategies, with a goal of going to Eugene City Council and then Springfield City Council in February with the draft strategies. That will give us enough information to start our action planning process. And then we will have the formal public notice process for the draft strategies after the 2 council meetings. Any questions? I know that's a lot of information. Yes. Okay.
Great.
So let's briefly talk about the impediments to fair housing, and then I think with the remaining time is really, I think it would be great if we could just go around the room and hear from people's ideas about needs and any comments that folks have about the strategies. And then I think this would be good if we could spend some more time on this at future HPB meetings as well. So in terms of the impediments to fair housing, there is a kind of much more significant report that has a lot of data in it. But I think what's sort of most important for this conversation is for folks to begin thinking about what are the impediments to fair housing. And I thought it would be helpful to share what was created in 2010. Typically, we would do this planning process once every 5 years. However, in 2015, HUD was about to come out with an entirely new set of requirements, and they were going to dramatically change the process to what's called an assessment of fair housing. However, they changed the process, and then there was a change in administration, and that process was repealed. And so now we're back to the process that we did in 2010. So, but we did in that interim period do some work through the Lane Livability Consortium called the Equity and Opportunity Assessment. So really, when we think about fair housing, there are broad impediments that affect multiple protected classes, and then of course there's more specific impediments that might affect specific protected classes. And so when we think about the overall supply of affordable housing, this was the first impediment that was identified in 2010. And I think everyone is pretty familiar with that, so we don't need to go over the details of it. The second impediment was that there is a limited awareness of fair housing policies in the broader community. This is an issue that definitely, as we did the renter protection survey, we saw a continued set of challenges around awareness of fair housing issues. And so this is definitely something that has continued to be a challenge. The third impediment is there are market conditions and housing industry practices that increase housing costs or decrease housing choice. This really relates to the regulatory issues that we're working through the Housing Tools and Strategies. House Bill 2001, 2003, I would say are very much related to this as well. The next one is there are cultural differences and language barriers that inhibit access to fair housing. I would say that those issues definitely were present in the survey, and we've heard of additional barriers in addition to just simply language access issues. Impediments, email, and the internet have become vital to accessing housing opportunities and subsidy programs, providing a barrier for those without computer access at home. This is definitely a continuing issue, and I would say that the industry has become even more internet-based since this point in time. And then lastly, people with disabilities who have special housing needs have limited choices and are often constrained by lower incomes. I will say that our fair housing plan was a fairly short list. If you look at other analyses of impediments that have been conducted in the past 10 years by other jurisdictions, there's definitely a longer list and probably more specificity around access for certain populations. And so as part of this process, we're definitely going to take a look at those other impediments to fair housing to get a sense of what are some of the other barriers that other jurisdictions have identified in their processes. I'll stop there. Any questions before we talk about needs or talk about what kind of, any comments that folks want to make?
I think, I'm not sure where this fits into barriers, but Eugene is not unique in having neighborhood associations, but we do have neighborhood associations which give voice, organized voice to various neighborhoods. Those neighborhood associations tend to be dominated by homeowners, and there's not adequate representation from renters, and there's a variety of reasons for that, but it gives a much stronger voice to slow redevelopment of residential neighborhoods, and city council has to listen. And I don't think it's unique to Eugene, but it's just stronger here than in other municipalities that I'm aware of.
Very good.
I don't see gentrification among these. Do you think it's included?
You don't see
gentrification included among these
Yeah.
as an impediment? So,
That's a good point.
kind of the 10-year-old perspective, things have changed.
Okay.
I think when you went through, you may have missed the land availability on
Speak up, I'm sorry.
the second impediment.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't talk about that.
Yes. Yes, suitable sites. Oh, sorry, I did skip over that one. Yes, so the second impediment on page 1 is suitable sites for future low-income housing construction are difficult to find, are expensive to acquire, and some have may have constraints that limit development opportunities. Okay.
So tell me again, so this was from the 2015 plan?
2010.
2010.
2010. It says it down at the bottom, at the footer. So
you have to redo this for 2020.
correct. So we will be spending time at the Renter Protections Committee talking about this in more detail. My hope is that the consultants will have the data analysis done so we can present that. I think what we can do is share some additional strategies from other planning processes and start to kind of brainstorm what impediments can look like. I'll bring those back at a future meetings for discussion. We also want to do some specific outreach to organizations and communities of color. And so we may be doing some specific outreach or workshops to those organizations and communities of color. And I guess what I'd like to do is also, if there aren't any more comments about fair housing, I'd like to kind of go back to the strategies for housing that are in the con plan. I think one of the things I'm trying to gauge at this point is, as an overall framework, do folks feel like these strategies have worked fairly well? Are there things that you feel like need to be changed at the very high level? That was slide 13 on page 7.
I don't know where it fits exactly, but would it be worth somewhere in one of these documents just commenting about the administration of affordable housing implementation, like on the city's part, is expensive. The administration is expensive and complicated, and that the CET and some of these other
The bureaucracy.
Yeah, just that, finding other solutions to be able to have funding mechanisms that are more flexible is a goal. Right, exactly. But that's not really, captured necessarily. I mean, you talked about it in terms of strategy of different funding streams, but that...
I mean, that's the impediment for sure.
Right, the complexity and the cost of administering is an impediment, I guess.
Can I follow that?
Mm-hmm.
So the complexity and cost of administration means you can't see the forest for the trees. It means that people that are struggling to survive are not privy to the meetings where there's all these little slivers of resource organized by slivers of boards. And it really is a disconnect. I think the elephant in the room is a fundamental disconnect between need and ability to provide, much less communication between those in need and those in a position to attempt to provide. So maybe this is really, I apologize, but again, another elephant in the room. When this was written, the distribution of wealth and resources looked a lot different than it does now. And when this was written, Eugene wasn't the second most constrained housing market in the United States as it is now. So when you look at some of these frameworks, it's frustrating to me. So as I was looking at your community development block grant, I don't know if there's space in looking at the criteria. I don't know if there's space for this, but I think at some point, and I hear this on the county with different of the services that the county provides, people are required to engage the community, take community surveys, take community input. They usually get 1% or half. I mean, it's really a narrow percent that represents this disconnect. And I'm wondering, is there room to develop a group of, let's call them paraprofessional community health workers that are literally helping navigate the system for their neighbors in their communities on the ground that have different needs? I mean, does that exist, where they also become agents for getting more real and substantive input from communities on different programs such as this? Because it's tough to navigate out there, where these people could even be proponents and advocates for various homeowners to develop ADUs that meet the criteria for some of the capital expenditure that you're talking about. I'm just wondering, is there room to start from the ground up? Chris, hopefully you'll like this. Start organizing. Is there room to create that kind of level of extension of service delivery where you're empowering the people this program is supposed to help by giving them $5,000 or $6,000 or $10,000 a year training and helping them navigate the system on behalf of their neighbors in their communities, on their blocks, where they live? That's a question.
I think you've hit on a really important aspect of the TAC report, because 9 of their 10 recommendations dealt with how to help and keep people in housing, and the notion of navigation services, whatever those would look like.
I'm talking about something fundamentally different than the TAC report, Chris.
Well, but it's about housing, right?
It's about housing, it's about health services, it's about mental health, it's about opioid addiction.
And I
it's about
completely
all-
agree. And the notion of being able to provide comprehensive navigational services would be the next step.
I'm sorry.
So the TAC report gets that navigation concept, a foothold. And then you can take that navigation concept, which interestingly, when I was working at United Way many years ago, we brought in somebody who set up an entire navigation program, matched people with navigators, and it didn't work extremely well because it wasn't kept up. There was nobody keeping an eye on it, so it kind of just filtered away. But even in the short time it was there, that navigation concept worked extremely well. So what I'm saying is the TAC report is the opportunity to get something like that started, and then it can branch out into all these other areas, because I think navigation is critical to a whole series of benefits people need in order to be able to be self-sufficient and sustainable, way beyond just housing.
Right, completely agree. I would call it empowerment. And again, the question is thank you, is there any room in the CBDG to support something like that tied to all the other things?
So the activity is community organizing.
No, the activity, that would be a subset. That would happen regardless, right? Because you're on the ground.
Right.
The activity is navigators, as Chris said, for low-income populations where the service is provided by a low-income person designated that's living in that area to their neighbors, like neighbors helping neighbors.
So that is, that would
I'm
be
done.
considered a public service, and that's subject to the 15% limitation.
So there is a room, but that's where it would be.
Right, so those are the dollars that are, allocated through the Human Services Commission.
Well, but the tough thing there is I'm on that. And that doesn't have enough money even to,
Correct.
right? I'm just saying,
Correct.
yeah.
So that's the box that it fits within the CDBG program, and so you have to make choices about how you want to
Well-
use that resource.
And I'm sorry, everyone, finally, last question. I believe in creating resources. Do people, never mind. It's just frustrating, but thank you, got it.
I would like to add that the Renters Protection Committee has been struggling with some of the issue that Joe is raising. We heard from a lot of community organizations, I'll point to Karen and also CCS, who provide, have programs with navigators who try to deal not with just a problem, housing, but often lack of housing is due to other problems as well, and try to address the whole problem. Of course, there's not enough money to support that, but there are efforts in the community to provide that.
Gotcha.
And I guess I would also add, so one effort that is now underway that has been funded by United Way is a collaboration between Homes for Good and Cornerstone, which really is focusing on creating peer support specialists. And so but these peer support specialists are operating in affordable housing developments that have been supported through these resources. So I think this is again kind of thinking about United Way funding, much more flexible, able to implement a creative idea which actually came from those two organizations to create a peer support specialist model in affordable housing developments.
That makes sense.
So John and then Jenna.
So looking at the 4 objectives from 2015, the thing that I'm more appreciative of now than I have ever been, in fact I've often argued against it, would be increasing the supply of all housing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about infill and House Bill 2001 and ADUs. They aren't necessarily going to be affordable housing units. But unless we increase the whole supply, the market's going to drive the prices of everything else up.
Correct. Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily, we couldn't use, the funding sources couldn't be used to fund the construction of those units, but I think they could be used to address the barriers to those.
Well, you can't ignore it, yeah.
I don't know, at least that would be a thought. Whether we could use some of that money to, whether that should be a goal of ours in the strategic plan, to look at ways to encourage more private sector development.
Jeff, do you want to say something?
Just kind of building on what Joe was mentioning, would it be worthy to add an impediment that there's limited funding available for helping to, like, creating a system to help people navigate the process of connecting to housing and broader services?
So I was actually thinking about something like that when Joe started talking about navigators, because I couldn't figure out what the hell he was talking about.
Me neither, till Chris told me what I was talking about.
And then I was thinking, well, that sounds a little bit like what Homes for Good is doing now, having a navigator help people with vouchers. But you could also do a navigator to help people who want to build an ADU or want to build a duplex, or I don't know whether the provider feel like they need a navigator. Sometimes I think they do. Feel like they need a navigator to help them deal with city issues.
Well, especially if you get into ADUs, which is homeowners or rental homeowners.
You heard Rick Wyman talk about the difficulty of building an ADU by himself after working for the city and the county for 40 years. You come away thinking, this is hard to do, and not many people are going to do it.
Yeah, one other thought, and I don't know how it fits in here, but I'll just follow Joe's lead and toss something out there, is I think that there's certain types of housing that are fundamentally affordable, and it's smaller housing, and we have so many structures in place that disincentivize building smaller housings as far as lot sizes and all of that stuff. And when you build a 600, 700, 800 square foot home, fundamentally it's going to be more affordable for the people to live there because of construction costs and utilities and all those things. And one of the things out of the housing tools and strategies that I was most impacted by was the fact of how much of the Eugene city is living alone, but they're living in houses that do not accommodate people living alone. And we don't have anything in place that is incentivizing building, at that level, and everything's working against that. And so, and that's something that no one of us private citizens can probably go and build an apartment complex, but you can build a house. And if we were to look at ways that we can create opportunities to do that easier, then we might create a larger amount of stock of houses that will be affordable forever. Whether that's deed restricted or not, it will still be more affordable. So if there's a place that we can emphasize that, I would be interested in seeing that.
And the existing housing stock, as we've got too many single people rambling around in big houses.
Right.
And the difficulty in turning that one house into multiple dwelling units, it's
complicated.
That's complicated and difficult in Eugene.
and significant, really.
Hmm?
If we can anticipate the future, some of these 3 and 4 and 5 and 6,000 square foot homes, if the ability to easily convert those into 3 and 4 and 5 units, which has been done in other cities, would be a big deal.
Thank you.
One more, just as far as impediments go, kind of listening to all this, kind of made me think about the last two impediments, which were like email and internet access and people with disabilities, have special housing needs. What it doesn't really come out and say is if you have mental health issues and you've been homeless for 2 months, that's a major impediment to getting out. So.
Chronic issues, serious problems.
And I would just say, this is just the beginning of this conversation. Part of this is, I'm presenting a lot of information, kind of giving folks some of the past, and then we'll be talking more about this at future meetings, talking about it at the Renter Protections Committee meeting. But I know it's helpful for folks to have a little bit of time to kind of mull this over. And we have a huge amount of data that was collected through the Renter Protection Survey that we'll definitely be combing through and kind of developing. But I think it's also helpful to just kind of have a blue sky discussion where folks can share any thought that they have related to impediments. I would also just share, the impediments aren't just for rental housing, they are also for homeownership. And so that doesn't really have specific impediments in our 2010 plan that relate to homeownership, but it absolutely is intended to cover impediments to homeownership too that affect protected classes as well.
Anybody else? I think that does it. Anything for the good of the order? Then we'll, 5 minutes early, we shall adjourn.
Thank you.